Hey everybody! In this video we are going to continue learning how to mix skin colors, this time with watercolor. So obviously I have a lot of different colors going on, but some of my favorite colors to work with is I like to have kind of a warm and cool version of each of my primary colors. So I like to have a warm red, kind of like a naphthol red, and a cool red, alizarin crimson. I like a warm yellow, like a yellow ochre is excellent in skin tones. My blues, I think my favorite blues to use would be ultramarine blue for my warm blue and cerulean or cobalt for my cool blues. And then obviously brown. So we're going to have a warm brown and a cool brown as well. For example, burnt sienna and burnt umber. Those are pretty much our standard colors. A couple other colors in watercolor that I really like to use with watercolor would be cobalt violet, and I also like to use potter's pink or rose madder genuine. Those are some really nice kind of pinkish flesh tones that I think work really nicely when you're mixing skin colors. So I'm actually going to start with a dark skin tone that has kind of cooler undertones. So there's kind of like a bluish cast to it in the shadows. It's a little bit warmer in the highlights, but what I'm going to start with is working with my burnt sienna to start with. I think I'll probably mix in some burnt umber as well, just to darken it up a little bit. In this case, I might even use Van Dyke brown, which is going to be a really nice dark brown. If you don't have Van Dyke brown, literally you just take your brown and add some ultramarine blue, and that's going to darken it up for you. So maybe I'll just do that and make it a little easier. So when I mix in my ultramarine blue, my brown is going to darken up and cool down a bit. So to get started, I'm just going to kind of work on the nose, I think. The best way, I think, to work with skin tones in facial features especially is to glaze your colors. So you want to layer your colors up. You want to kind of build them up by adding or glazing colors over one another. Glazing really adds kind of some depth and richness to your colors, and it makes them a lot more interesting to look at, which is why I am a big fan of that technique. When we work with watercolor, the majority of our time is honestly just spent watching paint dry. It's very exciting. As you can see, I'm kind of dropping in a little bit of blue here in the shadows, in those cooler areas. And that's going to cool down my colors as I'm working. If you have it, you could also use ultramarine violet, which is a little obviously more violet than blue, but still pretty bluish, and that's going to really lend itself nicely to this darker skin tone. So I'm just going to add that into my wash. And while that's drying, I think we will move on to another skin tone so that I can come back to this when it's dry and add some more glazing over the top. So the next color that we are going to work with is kind of a neutral, like an olive skin tone. So medium skin tone. It's got kind of both warm and cool in it, so that's why we call it neutral. All right, so as I work with this one, I'm going to kind of have a similar base to what I started with here. So I'm going to have some burnt sienna. I might even take some yellow ochre to get more of that olivey tone to it, and then mix it in kind of with some of the darker browns that I used earlier. So why don't we just do noses all around? So I'm just going to kind of block out the middle shadows of this nose here, and I'm just using some clean water to kind of fade out some of my edges. And then I think in some of the less intense areas, I'm going to have a little more of the yellow ochre. I'll pull some of that up. And then there are some kind of bluish areas in the shadows. And so I think kind of in the darker shadows is more of an ultramarine, but in the lighter shadows, it's a little more of a cerulean. So we're going to play around with our blues in here. And I'm just going to add a little bit. I don't want to mix it too much because I don't want to make green, but I do just want to cool down some of that yellow ochre that I laid down. I'm grabbing a little cerulean and I'm going to layer it over the nostril area and the bottom of the nose where it's a little cooler, and just a tish up the side of the nose. And as of right now, I've got kind of a lot happening in my washes, so I think I'm going to let this dry just a little bit and come back to it to layer some more, because obviously you can't do it all wet on wet. That gets a little messy, so we want to give it a break. We'll come back, start adding in some details and glazing. So let's focus on a lighter skin tone. Here we have a warm, light tone. So here what I think I'm going to do is, instead of starting with a brown, I'm actually going to start with kind of a mixture of a soft red and yellow, so kind of an orange. I think if you don't overdo it, it will work its way out here. So I'm not going to do a ton with this orangey color, but it'll be a good base as I start working. So the side of the nostril's got a little more yellow in it. The other side has kind of a cooler shadow happening. So I'm just going to block in some areas here and then go in to create my details later. I think I'll add just a slight bit of brown onto the shadowed side, and then I'll go over it with some blue as a glaze later. So usually when I work with these lighter skin tones, I like to start with just kind of a soft wash of yellow and then slowly add in my washes of red over it to give it those warmer undertones, and then I just kind of build up and up. So honestly, just depending on the skin tone that you're working with, is whatever wash you're going to start with is kind of the base of your undertone. All right, now that our first washes are dry, we can start adding on some glazing of additional colors. So in the darker skin tones, what I think I'm going to do is start building up my browns. So I want to have some nice washes of burnt sienna, maybe a little more of that ultramarine in there too, but I'm going to go just straight burnt sienna first to kind of warm up some of these areas and provide a little bit more detail. I'm going to soften up some of my edges with just clean water. So as you can see, the glazing, you can still kind of see underneath it to the bluer areas. That's going to give us this sort of like nice translucency in our colors. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep going back and forth over these areas to slowly build up my values. And while that dries, we'll move on. So as I work on this nose, I think I'm going to add in some more yellow ochre layers. I like to slowly build up my values in my colors. I don't like to do it too immediately because I like the translucency and transparency I get through glazing. Obviously you could do it in one shot if you wanted to. Many watercolor artists do that. But this is just how I work, which is probably why it takes me forever to paint things. 90% of my life is watching paint dry. But just look at that lovely transparency of the blue just kind of hinting through the yellow ochre that we have here. It's very lovely. So I think it's worth the patience. I'm going to add just a little hint of red into this wash right here at the top of the nose where it's a little warmer. like just a little sun-kissed. And soften up these edges just a tish. All right, we'll let that dry. Obviously we can barely see what's going on here right now, so we're gonna kind of start to give it a little more oomph. I think I'm going to go in with that pinkish color again and just lay down a little bit more. Especially when we're working on these lighter skin tones, you don't want to go too heavy too fast, because otherwise it starts to be a little too much. Obviously you could go a little darker in your shadows. I'm going to add just a tish of cerulean into the shadows here. And what I really like about cerulean is how it granulates. It gives it a really nice texture. And I mean, you don't see it super apparently when you have such a light wash of it, but if you make your wash a little more saturated, you're going to start seeing the pigment separating. And I think that's just a really nice texture to have, whether it's in skin or anything really. It's just lovely. And by mixing this kind of warm red with a cool blue, I end up with kind of this murky neutral color, which I'm actually going for. Normally you don't want to do that if you want more of like a pure hue to make like a violet, but this makes a really nice kind of murky brown color, which is good in this instance. We're just going to soften up some of these edges, and we will let things dry once again. All right, we're going in for round 3. So as I am looking at the nose on the darkest skin tone, there's actually kind of this violet tone to the highlight. So I'm actually going to use some of that cobalt violet that I was talking about and just kind of do a wash over everything really lightly. It'll knock it back in space just a bit, but also give it kind of that violet tone. So just really subtle. So I'm going to start grabbing some more saturated hues to go in this one here. So I think I'm going to start using some more reds and browns. So there's kind of this warmer area right at the bridge of the nose and around the nostril. Once I have those shapes blocked in, then I can kind of soften the edges a little bit with water. And then I think in some of these areas I'm also going to start with kind of a bluish brown mixture. So I'm going to grab a little bit of ultramarine and some, let's do a cooler brown, some burnt umber. If you really want to cool your brown down, you could mix in some yellow ochre or even raw umber. It's going to give it more of a greenish hue to it, which honestly with an olive skin tone works out pretty well. So once I have that mixture in, I'm going to start kind of blocking in the shapes of the nostrils and some of the shadows along the bridge of the nose here. It kind of blends in with the red we just laid down. I'm just going to drop in a little bit of this cerulean next to the red, just for a little pop of color. All right, we'll let that sit, and then I think we will head to our lighter one once more. All right, I'm going to grab some more of that cerulean, and I think I'll mix in just a little bit of burnt umber. Yes, that layers really nicely over the red that we put down. And I think this skin tone could benefit from some of that cobalt violet as well. I got a little heavy with my hue. I'm going to tone it down just a tish and just wash it out with a little bit of water. And drop in a little bit of that cobalt violet. Like cerulean, the cobalt violet really granulates very nicely and creates a good texture. Let's continue on our journey. I think I'm going to add some more blue in here, maybe a little more brown to deepen our shadows. Now when I paint with watercolor, I almost never use black. I feel like it's kind of harsh. A lot of painters, I think, kind of feel that way about black. It's too much. I personally almost always use Payne's Gray and Van Dyke Brown as a mixture to create an almost black. I feel like it's a lot richer. I don't know, I personally prefer it. And as I start to gain my details in here, then I'm going to start dry brushing and using a lot less water. I find that to be kind of a better technique as I work through everything. And I want to just kind of add some of this blue in here to show those cooler undertones as I work. So as I'm laying the blue down, the transparency of the glazes is really going to start shining through. As I'm feathering out my washes here, I'm using less and less water to do so. So it's starting to almost become a dry brush at this point. It's going to maintain the darker value of my washes. I'm not losing as much of the intensity of the color now as I do this. So as I begin building up, I start using less water. I'm starting to mix in a little bit more red in with the browns over here to kind of warm things up a little bit in the shadows. And the yellow ochre really adds a nice pop of intensity and kind of pulls the skin tone together as we add it on top of everything. So it works well underneath, but also on top. I'm going to grab some Payne's Gray now, which is a very dark blue, very grayish blue, and I'm going to take that and start mixing it in with just a hint of brown to create my very dark values that I will use in the shadows here. This is one of my favorite mixtures to work with. It really helps create a nice sense of contrast. And where I have these areas of darkest shadow, I'm going to wash out my brush, kind of dry it off a little bit, and then just feather out those edges to smooth my shadows a little bit. I don't want to overdo it, but it's going to just kind of soften the edges. The only downside to this mixture is it has a tendency to lift, so it doesn't like to stay put. If you work over it a little too much, it's going to just pop right off. I think I want to add in just a hint of magenta in here. I want to be careful with it because it's pretty intense, so just a really light wash of it I think will, give it just a little pop of color. I really like to use subjective color, just hints of it in my paintings. I think that little pop of the unexpected can be really fun. Alright, we're going to start building up our darker values here as well. I really want to start shaping the nose. It's almost like sculpting. As I begin to work in the shadows over here, they're going to be a bit warmer than the other two. So I'm adding in a little bit of red into those shadows. I think that will kind of help balance out the hues of the skin. And I'll bring some of that same shadow up higher to kind of balance everything out. All right, so there you have it. We've got 3 different skin tones. Obviously, I could keep painting these kind of in perpetuum forever. But, you know, we've got warm, fair skin, we've got kind of a neutral olive tone skin, and a cool, darker skin tone. So you can kind of see how I've used a variety of just different warm and cool primary colors in addition to some warm and cool browns to create these skin tones through glazing. So hopefully that was helpful for you. Stay tuned for a video on skin tones with acrylic paint. Thanks for watching and keep creating.